All right, let's just jump right in. If you're a startup founder in Europe, chances are you've had a conversation that goes a little something like this. Raising capital here feels, well, impossibly hard. It's this nearly universal frustration, right? You constantly hear that founders aren't ready, or maybe that the funds just haven't proven themselves yet. But what if we're actually looking at this entirely the wrong way? In this explainer, we're going to unpack some incredibly fascinating insights that completely reframe this whole situation. We're not talking about bad luck, we're not talking about bad timing. We are looking at a systemic loop, a machine that's functioning exactly as it was built to, even if the end result is literally starving innovation. So the first big question we've got to ask is this: is the European venture ecosystem just one massive broken machine? Because typically you've got three distinct rooms of people, all just pointing fingers at each other. You've got the founders saying investors are way too timid. Then you have the fund partners claiming the founders just aren't prepared. And then you have the limited partners, the LPs, saying the funds in this region haven't proven anything actually worth backing. It's three rooms, same exact irritation, always aimed one step up the ladder. But what's so compelling about the source material we're digging into today is that it stops treating these as three separate complaints. Instead, it views them as a singular, malfunctioning chain reaction. Section 1. The European Funding Machine. Jan Kasper hits the nail on the head with this fascinating dynamic. He says the average European mindlessly ends up in real estate. And honestly, this is the very beginning of that chain reaction. Here in Europe, private wealth has a default destination, and it's property. It's bricks, it's mortar, it's land. And because capital naturally flows toward the safest perceived asset, it starves the venture capital ecosystem at its absolute source. There simply isn't this deep cultural pool of private money eager to take wild risks on unproven high-growth ideas, at least not in the same way you see in other parts of the world. And this triggers a massive, vicious cycle. Let's break it down. It kicks off with step 1, wealth flowing straight into real estate. Because all that money is tied up in property, we hit step 2. The venture funds that actually do exist are relatively small. Now, small funds mean small checks, and crucially, they absolutely cannot afford to be wrong, which triggers step 3, extremely high risk aversion. These funds take a notoriously long time to make any kind of decision, and by the time they finally do, their anxiety pushes us into step 4, predatory equity terms. Basically, they demand a massive piece of the company just to justify taking the risk. Because of this, founders either pack up and leave the region entirely, or they quietly resize their business plan to fit whatever tiny amount of money they actually manage to scrape together. And that brings us to the fatal step 5. Resized, compromised companies simply do not yield massive exits. No big exits mean no big returns to feed back into the system, and boom, the loop starts all over again. And the output of that loop? It's completely measurable. Take Central and Eastern Europe, the CEE region. It makes up roughly a third of the continent's entire population, yet it captures a measly 5.5% of Europe's venture money. The rest of Europe takes 94.5%. If you do the math on that, a founder in Central and Eastern Europe is operating at about a sixth of the funding intensity of a founder elsewhere on the map. And if we zoom out even further to the macro level, Europe as a whole puts around 0.2% of its GDP into venture capital. Compare that to 0.7% in America. The capital just isn't flowing into innovation. Section 2. The trader versus the VC. George Panagiotopoulos, a startup ecosystem expert, perfectly described two wildly different versions of the exact same pitch meeting. Over in the US, the investor opens with, "Hey, thank you for taking the time. Tell me more about your product." You talk as peers, as equals. You ask for $2 million for a 20% stake, and the answer is often, "Fine, done." But then, imagine the European side. The investor sits down, crosses their arms, and opens with 5 words, "Why do you want my money?" Instantly, the posture is defensive skepticism. The whole room just tilts, the power dynamic shifts, and suddenly you are justifying your very existence rather than building a partnership. So why does this happen? Well, it boils down to fundamentally mismatched mentalities. The European mindset is super heavily influenced by what we can call the trader instinct. Making money by buying cheap and selling expensive is that classic buy low, sell high mentality, which, hey, works great in real estate. But venture capital? It is entirely different. VC is all about paying to be right once enormously. So when a European angel investor applies a trader's instinct to a startup, they try to shave a few percentage points off the entry price. They haggle. But a slightly cheaper entry price does practically nothing for a fund's actual overall returns, all while severely damaging the founder's cap table. It often leaves the company completely uninvestable for future rounds. Section 3. Risk aversion in disguise. 1,000.
That is the actual number of rejections a Slovak founder received when trying to raise venture capital in Europe. And this was despite having a real company and solid contacts. But honestly, it's not the rejection itself that's the real tragedy here. It's the accounting of time. Every single week spent inside a European VC's sluggish, drawn-out process was a week spent explaining a business model that would inevitably change anyway, instead of, actually building the business. Unsurprisingly, that founder ultimately just went to the US and successfully raised there.
Branjo Vargic, who has raised money on both sides of the Atlantic, frames this dynamic absolutely perfectly. He says, that isn't rigor, it's risk aversion wearing rigor's clothes, and CEE imported it wholesale. You see, putting a founder through a 5-month diligence process or having a junior analyst read off a rigid checklist, it doesn't mean a fund is incredibly serious or thorough. What it actually signals is that nobody in that firm wants to be the one to stick their neck out and sign the check. The fear of failure completely overrides the pursuit of outsized success. And the ultimate proof of this is hidden right in the numbers. Over recent decades, U.S. venture capital returns have sat around 14.6% a year. European venture funds? They limp in at roughly 8.6%. So all that endless diligence, all that defensive posturing, all those exhausting 5-month reviews, it wasn't actually buying safety. It was just buying worse financial outcomes. By trying so incredibly hard not to lose, the European ecosystem is actively preventing itself from winning.
Section 4. Breaking the chain.
Justin E. Lane, an American who successfully built his company over in Slovakia, offers a really clear roadmap out of this mess. First up, you can't just blindly copy Silicon Valley. The culture and the capital structures are just too different. Second, you have to adapt the best lessons to the local reality. But his most important point is this last one. One link in the chain must move first without asking for permission. Right now, we're basically in a giant Mexican standoff. The LPs are waiting for the funds to prove themselves. The funds are waiting for the LPs to give them money. And the founders are just waiting for the funds to write the checks. Somebody, whether it's an LP taking a bold bet, a fund cutting checks faster, or a founder flat out refusing predatory terms, someone has to take that first leap to break the stagnation. Which brings us to our final provocative thought for today. The money isn't missing. It's already here. It's literally sitting in real estate locked up in apartments that have had the lights off for a decade, representing the safest possible version of a continent that constantly claims it wants to build the future. So the real question we have to leave you with is this. Will the capital stay hiding in dark apartments, or will we finally turn the lights on? Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer, and I will catch you in the next one.